times. So what I'm going to do this evening is talk about the man who ultimately was responsible for the beginnings of the technology which should usher in those better times. As I'll explain in a minute, he lived about 5 miles up the road from where I'm sitting in that direction, and the road that you can't see on the other side of my laptop screen between Berkeley and Thornbury was one of his favourite horse rides. So he's very much a man of these parts. So I've called the talk Edward Jenner, a man who changed the face of the world. It sounds a little bit melodramatic, but I hope by the end of the talk to have convinced you that that's a rather fair way of looking at it. So I need to set the scene first of all with some thumbnail statistics about smallpox. COVID-19 is a pretty mean bugger of a disease, but smallpox was much, much worse. And if you just bear the figures for COVID-19 in mind as we go through the statistics for smallpox, I think you'll see what I'm trying to get at. Smallpox was around badly with us for about 2.5 centuries. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Fraser Harris, who was the professor of medicine in Halifax, Nova Scotia, made a comment that we are already forgetting what smallpox was like. And the reason he said that was that throughout North America, smallpox was already beginning to disappear. In fact, it had disappeared from large tracts in North America by then. And the reason for that was the large-scale application of Edward Jenner's invention of vaccination. The problem was that smallpox was still around, and the story had quite a nasty sting in the tail. And when Fraser Harris spoke those words in 1914, smallpox would still be around free living on the planet for another 63 years. And in those years, it would kill more than both the world wars combined. So it's still very much a threat even then. And if we look at the headline stats for smallpox, then it was one of the great lotteries of life. You had a lifetime chance of getting it of about 1 in 3. If you got it, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of being killed by it. And globally, it killed about 1 person in 12. So it was one of the great scourges of mankind. It had the reputation of being a slayer of innocence because the vast majority of its victims were under 5 years of age. And if you got it and you survived, you weren't necessarily that lucky because about 1 in 3 of the survivors were badly scarred. And we're talking about pretty significant facial disfigurement in a large proportion of cases. And here's what it looked like. That's a control subject on the right there. A little bit of history. This is actually from an outbreak in Leicester in 1900, at around the time when the anti-vaccination movement was getting a grip in the UK, and it's obviously still with us today. Back then it was just focused on smallpox really, because that was effectively the only wide-scale vaccine that was around at the time. And one of these lads has been vaccinated, the other one obviously has not, and the unvaccinated one shows the clinical features of smallpox. And it was a pretty unpleasant disease. This lad is covered with 3,000 or 4,000 pustules deep in the skin. And if you cut him in half or stick him in an MRI scanner, then you'll see that lesions similar to that actually peppered him all the way through, including the vital organs. And that explains why the mortality was so very high. Throughout the history of medicine's attempts to deal with smallpox, we've come up with a lot of ideas and very, very little success. And it really is one of the catalogues of the therapeutics of despair. And just to take a look at some of the things that have been tried, if you go back to the 1670s, so that's 100 years or so before Jenner, then we find that leeches are being used to treat smallpox, but then leeches were used to treat everything. They did absolutely nothing for the vast majority of conditions, but simply having the doctor turning up with a big porcelain jar full of hungry leeches, sticking them on your arms and legs, and each one would then hoover up about 20 mils of blood. It was quite a palaver and something that was felt worth paying a hefty bill for, even though it did nothing for the disease. The colour red is quite interesting. And in Wales, in Central Africa, in China, Eastern Europe, lots of places, the colour red was thought to not only protect you against smallpox, but actually to cure it if you were unlucky enough to get it. And there's a great story about one of the Austrian emperors who was dying of smallpox, and they sent to Stroud, which again is about another 10 miles up the road from here, for heavy red English flannel, 3 yards of it, and has arrived and they wrapped him up in it and he dropped dead pretty well on the spot. So as clinical trials go, it's rather small scale, but it does rather suggest that the colour red was not that good. Also no good, coming in 100 or so years later, were drugs that made you throw up or give you torrential diarrhea. And a couple of the senior doctors in the Royal College of Physicians in London actually fought a duel with swords on the steps of Gresham College to try and prove which one of these was the better. And obviously neither of them did any good at all. 100 years after that, leeches amazingly are still around. So are drugs to give you diarrhea. Again, doing no good at all. 100 years after that, well, I'm a medical student. We have the intensive therapy unit. We have various antiviral drugs, but those drugs were not particularly good against smallpox, the pox viruses. And although ITU could keep your lungs ventilated and your heart going, your kidneys perfusing and the rest of it, the bottom line, even then, was about the same as it had been a couple of 100 years earlier. In other words, mortality, depending on the particular strain of smallpox, was still anywhere between 20 and 50%. So a miserable brute of a disease, and one that was effectively untreatable. Now, luckily, as we know, it's preventable, and this is where Edward Jenner comes into the story. Now, you may know that there are a couple of nuances to the best known version of the story of Jenner and vaccination. For example, he wasn't the first to think of vaccination. He wasn't the first to do experiments with him, with vaccination. There was a Dorset farmer called Benjamin Jesty, who actually went through everything that Jenner did, with the exception of publishing it, writing it up scientifically, and getting it taken seriously by the medical profession. But the concept of vaccination was not new. Other people had thought of it first. And one of the unsolved mysteries is whether Jenner really met the milkmaid that I'll tell you about in a moment, or whether he had picked up hints about vaccination from, for example, a medical colleague called John Fuster, who lived in the town of Thornbury, which is just to the south of Berkeley. And we know that Fuster was experimenting with vaccination, but didn't actually think that it did very much, so he dropped it. Now, the picture at the moment shows the River Severn. This is the area to the right of that is the Vale of Berkeley. I'm talking to you from Rockhampton, which is the big red dot. Nobody has yet died of excitement in Rockhampton. It's a very small village, but it's very nice. And it is 5 miles to the south of Berkeley, which is where Jenner was born, where he did his experiments, where he died, and where he is buried. And the area to the right of the Severn in that picture represents Edward Jenner's catchment area as a practicing country doctor. And it covers about 2,000 square miles. And Jenner used to patrol his patch, do house calls on horseback. And if you read his diaries, you'll see that he was pretty active as a clinical doctor some of the time. So for example, he goes on horseback to a farmer who's managed to rupture his abdomen, and Jenner sticks him on a kitchen table, pushes all the guts back inside, sews them up, and amazingly the man lives. So that's a day of medical heroics, but in the diary you'll see that there are plenty of gaps where he didn't do any medicine at all. He just went off on his horse and indulged his other pastimes of ornithology, fossil hunting, natural history, things like that. But he's very much a man of these parts. He's born in Berkeley, as I mentioned. Both his parents had died by the time he was 7 years of age. So he was sent to boarding school at Wootton under Edge, which is on the, as the name implies, on the edge of the Cotswold Escarpment, not too far from here. And a couple of things happened there. The first thing was that smallpox had broken out nearby. And this meant that as a condition of entry to the boarding school that year, all the new boys had to be protected against smallpox. And you might think, well, hang on, this is Edward Jenner, he's 7 years old, he's not yet invented vaccination. So how on earth could they possibly try and protect these new boys against smallpox? Well, the answer is a bizarre practice which is called variolation. I knew nothing about this until I started researching the book. I need to tell you just a little bit about it because it comes into the story in rather a poignant kind of way. Variola is the Latin name for smallpox. It means speckled. It's also the name these days for the smallpox virus. And the practice called variolation was where you actually took a healthy child and scratched smallpox pus into its skin. And if you think about the way that that lad on the left of the two schoolboys photographed looked, you might wonder why on earth somebody would want to do that. Well, somebody came up with the idea that if you could give somebody a mild dose of artificial smallpox, then they might be left protected against the disease if they survived, so that they might not, if they then met smallpox later in life, they might not then get it. And today we would think that that is mad, dangerous and bad. But in fact, as a medical procedure back then, this is in the 18th century, it did actually work remarkably well. And variolation became something of an English medical tradition. There were some practitioners of variolation who claimed that they could give artificial smallpox to tens of thousands of people without a single death from smallpox. And one of the first uses of medical statistics was actually to prove that it was safer to be variolated than to not be variolated and wait to catch smallpox in the usual way. Now, if there's time at the end, somebody may well ask, how on earth did variolation work? And if somebody's interested in that, then I think the right time is to try and explain that at the end, rather than interrupt the story now. But the point is that Jenner, as a young lad, was in boarding school. Smallpox was out nearby, so they decided to variolate, give artificial smallpox to all the lads who were going to school that year. And when variolation was originally brought to England, it was something that took about 15 seconds to do. In Greece and Turkey is where it came from to England, a little old lady traditionally would turn up with a bit of smallpox pus in a walnut shell and a rusty needle. She'd dip the needle into the pus, she'd scratch the pus into the skin of the child, and that would be it. When Jenner was variolated, it had evolved into a practice that took several weeks. And the reason for this was that English doctors practicing variolation could make as much money out of it as they possibly could. So Jenner and the other lads were locked up in the stables to keep them nice and cold. They were bled repeatedly to purify the blood. They were given laxatives, purgatives to give them nice therapeutic diarrhea. And 6 weeks later, Jenner was variolated. And he had a rather unpleasant dose of artificial smallpox. It didn't leave him scarred physically, but it did leave him scarred psychologically. And again, if you read his diaries and his letters, then even quite late in life, he's having flashbacks to this awful experience of coming out of the stables with smallpox. And he got better, he recovered, he lived obviously, but it was a very unpleasant experience. So it's interesting from a couple of viewpoints. One is to set the scene for vaccination, if you like, because the conceptual framework already existed for vaccination in variolation, where you're giving something to prevent a disease from attacking people later on. And the other thing is the impact personally on Jenner himself. And again, there are lots of reasons for him to pursue vaccination later on, but I think it's possible that one of them was that he had such a terrible experience with variolation that he was determined to come up with something better. So Jenner finishes school, he decides to go into medicine. He becomes a medical apprentice at the town of Chipping Sodbury, which is in the south part of Gloucestershire. And there, according to legend, he meets a milkmaid. And the milkmaid has come in for some complaint. And she sits down and Jenner starts the conversation by telling her that smallpox has arrived, it's back again, and that she would need to be variolated in order to protect her from smallpox. And she allegedly says to him, "You don't need to worry about that, Doc. I don't need to be protected against smallpox because I already am. And the reason for that is that I caught a disease called cowpox off one of my cows some years ago, and that means that I can never get smallpox." And again, we don't know if the milkmaid ever existed or if this conversation ever took place. It's in the biography of Edward Jenner, written by John Barron, who was not only Jenner's pupil, but was his greatest admirer. And it's possible that Barron wanted to portray Jenner as the amazing genius who came up with this idea, whereas it's quite possible that Jenner actually heard about this from medical colleagues and decided to try it out himself. Anyway, for what it's worth, we need to know about cowpox. So that's a picture there on the left of what the blisters of cowpox look like on the teats and udders of a cow. And this was actually quite well known in farming circles. If you were milking a cow that was infected with cowpox, if you had a little cut on your fingers, then some of the juice from those blisters could get in, and you would end up with a blister very much like that on your hand where the cut had been. That wasn't quite the end of the story, because a few days later you get a fever. The glands would come up under your arm, so you'd get pain under the arm. You'd feel unwell for a few days, then you'd get better. And the amazing thing that people had noticed was that if you had cowpox, it was benign, so you always got over it. So you have your cowpox, you get over it, and then you are apparently protected forever against smallpox. And people really believed that. So milkmaids who had had cowpox were sent off to nurse and look after people who are actually dying of smallpox. So cowpox protects against smallpox. Now, Jenner didn't know how to react to this, according to the legend. He'd never heard of cowpox, and it wasn't in any of the medical teachings that he'd come across. It wasn't known to the clever doctors. And when Jenner tried to spread word of cowpoxing as a way to protect against smallpox, people didn't want to believe it, because this was stuff that had bubbled up from the peasantry rather than being things that clever doctors and scientists had worked out for themselves. So if the milkmaid did exist, then it actually took quite a long time for Jenner to move on and actually put his ideas to the test. And it actually took him about 30 years after the time he would have met the milkmaid for him to get on to do the experiment. So in the meantime, Jenner goes off to London, and he goes to a centre of excellence. This is the School of Anatomy in Great Windmill Street in Soho. And there he falls under the spell of John Hunter, FRS, Fellow of the Royal Society. John Hunter was an amazing man. He ran the anatomy school. He was a surgeon at St. George's Hospital in London. And he was the man who taught Jenner a lot when Jenner was doing the London phase of his medical training, and who also continued to have contact with Jenner after Jenner came back to South Gloucestershire. And John Hunter, he was known as the surgeon extraordinary to His Majesty the King, and he really was extraordinary in so many senses. He was a real scientist and a polymath. And unlike Jenner, virtually everything that he got interested in and touched, he managed to turn into gold. So for example, he was interested in how lizards regenerated their tails. So while he was an army and navy surgeon with the French Navy, with the English Navy at that time, fighting against the French off the Brittany coast, he spent half his day extracting musket balls from soldiers and repairing cannonball wounds, and the rest of the time chopping the tails off lizards to see how the tails regenerated. He had the habit of dissecting exotic animals in public, including things like the electric eel. And he was a great showman, so he very much enjoyed public displays of his surgical virtuosity. He was also interested in the freaks of nature, including giants. And if you look at the top right-hand picture, of the corner of the picture, you'll see two very large skeletal legs hanging down. These belonged to a man called Byrne, the Irish giant, who was 7 foot tall. And when Byrne was still alive, Hunter wrote to him and said, "Dear Mr. Byrne, I think you're very interesting. When you die, can I have your body, please?" And Byrne said no. So unfortunately, after Byrne died, his relatives were worried that Hunter would come and dig him up, so they had him buried in a lead coffin under heaps of stone and rubble. And sure enough, Hunter's men sneaked over by boat, they dug him up and they brought him back. And Hunter then leached all the flesh and fat off the bones, kept the bones, and they're still preserved today in the Royal College of Surgeons in London. And apart from Hunter's interest, there are a couple of interesting things about the giant skeleton. There was enough DNA left for them to be able to work out the mutation in the growth hormone gene that actually caused Byrne to oversecrete growth hormone and become gigantic. And there's a petition out there, which you can sign if you wish, which is to get Byrne's bones repatriated to Ireland to be buried with his ancestors, where actually I believe he probably should really be buried. Hunter was also interested in CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and in those days he had a reputation as a resurrectionist, able to bring somebody recently killed back from the dead. Unfortunately, it wasn't very good. His public test came when a cleric was sentenced to be hanged for fraud, and this poor man climbed the gallows with a smile on his face, because waiting at the foot of the gallows was John Hunter, who was going to bring him straight back to life. And obviously that experiment didn't go entirely according to plan. So a great maverick, a great showman, a brain the size of a planet, and an ego probably twice as big as that. And he had a couple of risk factors. He had a very, very bad temper. He was very good at making friends, but he was even better at making enemies. And his enemies included many of his surgical colleagues in London. And he also had angina. So that's a triad, if you like, of bits of misfortune, which will come into the story later on. So here's Edward Jenner. He's been to London to complete his medical training. He's come back to Berkeley. He's by no means yet the father of vaccination. He's a quiet country doctor. And he sort of settles back into the quiet life, if you like. So he's a gentleman doctor. There's enough money in the family tree for him not to have to do medicine every day. So he goes off and he indulges his other interests, as I mentioned. He's also a polymath. Like John Hunter, he's interested in birds, fossils, flowers, birds' nests, everything. But he's a dilettante, he's a drifter. And whereas pretty well everything that John Hunter investigated, he managed to get something out of, there's a long list of things that Jenner studied that he never quite managed to complete or write up or get anything useful out of at all. He was very fond of the good life. He used to be a good entertainer. I think an evening with Edward Jenner would be probably my preferred evening with anybody that I've met in the history of medicine and science. Just such a fascinating man, did so many things. Musician and a poet. Well, he played the flute or the fiddle, he sang, and he wrote poetry. And some of his poetry, I think it's fair to say, would now be judged as shockingly bad, but some of it is actually rather nice and it stood the test of time. And I think there is just time for me to recite a poem that he wrote on the death of a Dr. Waite. And Dr. Waite was famous, he was a physician, he was famous for his gingerbread nuts. These were biscuits with ginger, which were delicious, but they also killed intestinal worms, which were a major curse at the time. So when Dr. Waite died, Jenner wrote the following little rhyme, and it starts off with the Latin names of some of the intestinal worms that Dr. Waite's ginger nuts killed. Ascarides, Teres, Lumbrici, and all, ye chyle-sucking insects that tremblingly crawl, no more be afraid, you're quite safe in our guts, for Waite has done making his gingerbread nuts. So a man with a sense of humor as well as a bit of a poetic gift. While he was with John Hunter, he really impressed the Grand Master, and Hunter recognized Jenner as the best pupil he'd ever had. So he was John Hunter's star pupil. And that again put him in good stead, because when he came back to Berkeley, Hunter kept up a correspondence with him, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. But again, I think that this is one of the clues as to why Jenner was fixated on the science behind medical practice and why ultimately he pursued vaccination. As I've mentioned, Jenner was also the victim of variolation. And I think that this made him very keen to try and find something better than giving people smallpox to stop them from getting smallpox. So I mentioned the correspondence between John Hunter and Edward Jenner, his pupil. And Hunter wrote to Jenner, I do not know of anyone I'd sooner write to than you. And they were actually very close in their correspondence. Interestingly, we've only got one side of the correspondence. We only have the letters that John Hunter wrote to Jenner. We don't have the letters that Jenner wrote back. And the reason for that appears to be that John Hunter's brother-in-law, another surgeon called Everard Hume, was very jealous of Jenner, and he was very jealous of the relationship between John Hunter, his brother-in-law, and this bright young guy. And it's said that after Hunter's death, all of Jenner's letters were gathered up and burned by Everard Hume to sort of enact a revenge of a sort on this partnership. So here are some of the things that John Hunter wrote to Edward Jenner. He was very keen on Jenner just getting on and trying things out. If he had a good idea, then try the experiment, is what Hunter said. So as a way of keeping Jenner interested in the science rather than the clinical medicine, Hunter had him involved in doing experiments on hibernating hedgehogs. And this was a great preoccupation at the time. How on earth animals managed to go to sleep and wake up alive, having somehow lived through the winter. And Hunter had got hold of some rather early, very crude glass mercury thermometers with which he was measuring the core temperature of hibernating hedgehogs. And I'll leave you to imagine exactly how that might be done. But clearly it wasn't a great idea if you were a hedgehog. And this explains why a letter from Hunter reaches Jenner, which says, "Dear Jenner, thank you so much for the last 24 hedgehogs. I've used them all up. I am now hedgehogless. Can I have some more, please?" So Jenner sends off a crate with another 24 hedgehogs in it to London. Then Hunter gets interested in marine mammals. And he writes to Jenner and says, "Dear Jenner, I'd like a porpoise, please." And back then, the Bristol Channel was actually full of marine mammals. So Jenner's men went out in the boat and they brought back an 11-foot bottlenose porpoise, went off in a crate to Hunter. Hunter writes back and says, "Thank you so much for the porpoise. It was great. I dissected it in public. Everybody absolutely fascinated. It was lactating, but unfortunately the milk had gone off. So can I have another one, please? And this time I need to know what fresh porpoise milk tastes like." So apparently a note went back from Jenner to Hunter with another porpoise saying it's just like cow's milk, but with a bit of extra cream. So Hunter was the man that could get Jenner to collaborate on these bizarre experiments and drink porpoise milk as well. Jenner had a great idea, which was a way to make a particularly powerful emetic salt dissolve. And this stuff was very good at making people throw up, but it was very hard to get into solution. And Jenner worked out a simple way of dissolving it actually in Madeira wine. Turns out to be quite soluble in alcohol. So Jenner told Hunter about this, and Hunter said, "You must not tell anybody. You must just market it yourself, make a fortune," which is what you deserve to do because it's a brilliant idea. And Jenner said, "No, I'm going to tell everybody because I want people to share the benefits of what I've discovered." The enigma of the cuckoo chick. Well, this sounds crazy, but again, one of the great mysteries in biology and zoology was how the baby cuckoo chick got rid of all the other eggs and nestlings in the nest that the mother cuckoo had parasitized. And this was something which had puzzled the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and was a real good-going puzzle back when Jenner was a young man. And Jenner was an excellent field naturalist, and he worked out exactly how this was done. There's no time to do it now, but I can give you a demo at the end if there's any time, how the cuckoo chick gets rid of all the opposition in the nest. And for that bit of work, Jenner was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society, just as John Hunter had been. And they also wrote lots of personal things to each other. When Jenner's first child was born, John Hunter was the godfather, and they corresponded about that. And Hunter was always there when Jenner had a bad day to try and jolly him along. So they had a good ongoing scientific and personal relationship. Now, back to vaccination. We know that Jenner somehow picked up the idea of giving cowpox to protect against smallpox because he talked about it in a medical society that he belonged to. And this was called the Convivio Medical Society. They met in the Ship Inn at Alveston, which is just on the A38 on the Bristol Road, not too far from here. And there they would eat, they would drink, and they would talk medicine and science. And in the minutes, there's an interesting note from the chairman around 1788 saying, "We had a good meeting tonight, but if Dr. Jenner persists in talking about how he might use cowpox to stop people from getting smallpox, we're going to throw him out of the club because he's getting very boring about it." So he's clearly thinking about it, but he's not actually doing any experiments at all. And the experiments don't actually happen. He doesn't get around to trying the experiment as Hunter would have said, until 1796. And this is the sort of chocolate box representation, if you like, of this event, which is one of the most momentous events in the history of medicine and the history of science. This is the date of Jenner's first documented vaccination. And you're all aware of who's who probably, but I'll just remind you. So the young lad having stuff scratched into his arm is actually James Phipps, who is the 8-year-old son of Jenner's gardener. And he's the, as you see in this picture, not very willing guinea pig. We obviously have Jenner himself sitting on the chair there, administering this stuff, whatever it is. In the background, wearing the mop hat on the right, we have Sarah Nelms, who is a milkmaid living locally and the vaccine donor. And the reason that she's got a handkerchief over the back of her hand is that Jenner has just lanced a large blister of cowpox on the back of Sarah Nelms's hand. And we know who the provider of the cowpox was. This was, well, we know cowpox now, we know to be a virus. They didn't know exactly what it was then. But the source of the cowpox that infected Sarah Nelms and that Jenner is scratching into the lad's arm was a brown and white cow called Blossom. And she is omitted from the picture because she would rather fill it up. You can still see Blossom today. Her hide is spread out in the foyer of St. George's Medical School in London. It's really interesting. If you go to the Jenner Museum in Berkeley, you can see that there are a pair of horns that belonged to Blossom. If you go to the Royal College of Surgeons in London, you'll find a pair of horns that belong to Blossom. And in fact, if you tot up the number of horns around the place that belong to Blossom, there are quite a few. So she's rather like the saints whose sacred body parts used to do the rounds during the Middle Ages. Anyway, what exactly is Jenner doing here? Well, he's actually inoculating James Phipps with cowpox because he wants to see if he induces an artificial infection with cowpox, can he protect the lad against smallpox? And before Jenner did this experiment, he'd been collecting case reports. He had taken the milkmaid, or whoever it was, bless you, at face value, and he'd gone off to try and find cases who actually fitted the bill. In other words, people who'd had cowpox and had got over it, and then had encountered smallpox in a way that would have given anybody normal the disease smallpox, but had not caught it. So people who were apparently protected against smallpox by having caught cowpox. And he'd found about 20 or 25 cases like that, and he'd written them up. And what he's now doing is the experimental follow-up to that. So 14th of May, 1796, he scratches cowpox juice into the arm of the gardener's son. And it's exactly as the milkmaid would have described. There's a small blister where Jenner scratches the cowpox in. The lad gets a bit of a fever, he gets pain under his arm from the glands getting up, and then he's back to normal. Wonderful. So on the 1st of July, Jenner then has to prove that the lad is actually immune to smallpox. And there's only one way you can do that, and that's to give him smallpox and see what happens. And nowadays we'd say, you can't do that. You can't give a healthy child smallpox because it might kill him. But if you cast your minds back to variolation, you remember the artificial smallpox infection? Well, giving a healthy child a little dose of smallpox was actually a standard medical practice. So the things that Jenner did that day, actually giving the lad smallpox was the least worrying for the doctors of the day. And nothing happened at all. Normally, when you were variolated, you might get 50 or 100 smallpox blisters breaking out over the rest of your body. And that didn't happen. There was absolutely no sign of the smallpox having taken at all. So the lad was effectively protected against, or as we'd say today, immune to smallpox. So this was the great eureka moment. So Jenner does a dozen more experiments like this. He finds the same thing. He finds some more cases of people who've caught cowpox naturally and then didn't get smallpox. He writes it all up. He sends a paper off to the Royal Society. And remember, he's a fellow there because of his work on the cuckoo chick. And the Royal Society reject his paper. And it now seems that the reviewer of the paper was actually Everard Hume, the jealous brother-in-law of John Hunter, And the paper that he sent to the Royal Society was not perfect, but it seems that there was a bit of professional jealousy there as well, which meant that Everett Hume made sure that it was rejected. So what did Jenner do? Well, rather than rewrite and try again with the Royal Society, he decided to publish his findings himself. So he wrote it all up into a great big pamphlet, which is called An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Cowpox. And this was published in September 1798 by a printer in Soho. And anybody who could afford 7 and 6pence, which is actually quite a lot of money back then, could buy a copy of this and could effectively set themselves up as a vaccinator. And it was a very interesting work. If you read it today, then you'll see things that are wrong with it. But for its day, it was remarkable. It was effectively a do-it-yourself guide to vaccination. And Jenner not only explained what he thought was going on, but he told you how to identify the blisters of cowpox on cows or on people. Here's a picture of the back of Sarah Nelms's hand. And that great cratered blister you see right in the middle is the one that he stuck the knife in to get the cowpox juice out to scratch into the arm of the gardener's son. And this publication really took off. It went around England very, very quickly. In no time, it was across the channel, it was going through the continent, and it was picked up very quickly in North America as well. And it became a bestseller and a sensation. And to give you an idea, oh, sorry, I do need to say, this was published in 1798. So please remember that date. You'll see why that is significant at in a few minutes' time at the end of the talk. So 1798, Jenner's great world-changing paper is published. Here's an example of how quickly Jenner and vaccination became famous. This is a ceremony at the Medical Society of London in the 1800s, so just 2 years later. At the time, London was the great medical centre of the world. These doctors there were the top docs in London, probably among the best on the planet. And if you look at them, they look pretty smug. And there's one in the background there who doesn't look quite as clear-cut as the rest. There he is, and that's Jenner. And the reason he's sort of floating there is that he was added afterwards. So they ran off a few hundred copies of this great ceremonial engraving. Then somebody thought, hang on, Jenner is going to be really famous and we're going to look really silly if he's not in this picture. So they recalled all the prints. They told the engraver to put Jenner in, please. So the engraver got the copper plate out. He made a little image of Jenner, cut a hole in the original plate, stuck in the plug with Jenner's picture on it, and then they ran off more hundreds of copies and circulated those instead. So Jenner was all the rage here in England, and his invention metaphorically went all the way around the world just a few years later. And this is a map showing the voyage of the Royal Philanthropic Expedition of King Carlos IV, King Charles IV of Spain. And King Carlos got to hear about vaccination through a French translation of Jenner's inquiry and decided to send the divine gift of vaccination all the way around the world to the Spanish colonies. So this expedition started in La Coruña, Galicia, northern Spain. A little flotilla of boats sets off across the Atlantic. They reach the Caribbean. There they divide. One lot go down through, around the bottom of, into the heart of South America. And then they go back to La Coruña, getting home about 18 months later. The other lot land on the shore of Mexico. They cross Mexico on horseback. They reach the other side. They pick up another bunch of boats and they come around the back of the world, calling off at Manila, Macau, various other places on the way. And they get home 3 years later. And it's a remarkable story to read about. And wherever they went, news had gone ahead. So they had this rapturous welcome for the divine gift of vaccination. And again, the practice was spread wherever they went. They picked it up and they spread the word. Now, you might ask how they managed to get vaccination all the way across the Atlantic and down and around Central America, back around the world. Well, in the days before ethics committees, it was remarkably easy. So the night before they set sail, they popped down the road to the nearest orphanage where they acquired 20 orphaned Spanish boys. They stuck them on the boats. As they left harbour, they vaccinated the first two. 10 days later, each of those two lads had nice, juicy vaccination blisters full of cowpox. They stuck a needle in those, they kept as much of the juice as they could, and they used the remainder to vaccinate the next pair of boys. And so they went all the way, arm to arm, as it was called, all the way across the Atlantic. And when they got to Mexico, they dropped a contingent of Spanish boys off to be brought up by the church. They popped down the road to the nearest Mexican orphanage, where they acquired 20 Mexican orphans and used them to bring vaccination around the back of the world. So ethically, it's not exactly squeaky clean, but you know, it did the job and it spread the word. Jenner's efforts came to the attention of lots of people. Thomas Jefferson, the president of the US, who was pro-vaccination, unlike the recent incumbent, he predicted in not very many years after vaccination came in that future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed. In other words, Jefferson was predicting that vaccination would spell the death of smallpox. And indeed, by the time Jenner died in 1823, you could look around the world and see large areas that had been cleared completely of smallpox. For example, the northern Italian province of Lombardy was completely smallpox free. And there were many other areas the United States was beginning to show clearing of smallpox in quite large areas. So by the time Jenner died, if you like, he was already able to see the fruits of his labors. Vaccination did not just protect the individual vaccinated, but actually, if you vaccinated enough of a population, then you were building up what we now know to be what we now call herd immunity. So you would prevent the virus from having the means to spread from one non-immune individual to another. So now we jump forward to the middle of the 1960s and the World Health Organization deciding to get rid of smallpox for all time. And the map of the world, one rendition of it would have looked like this. The countries that are colored black there are the countries in which smallpox was still endemic. And you'll see there's still quite a bit of trouble in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the central block of Asia, that's India, Pakistan, Indonesia as well. If you'd gone back to the days before vaccination, then the whole of the world map would have been black, with the exception of the very top and the very bottom. So smallpox was everywhere. Here we are, whatever that is, 170 years after vaccination comes in, and we are seeing big inroads into smallpox. So North America is completely free, Europe is free, Northern Africa is free, Russia is free. The WHO then decides that this is the time to go for the all-out defeat of smallpox. And they decided in 1967 that they would have this global eradication smallpox program. And they set themselves the target of getting rid of smallpox in just 10 years. And that seems very ambitious. In the end, it took them just over 11 years. And it was a huge operation that required tens of thousands of people for all levels, right down to the very local level. And these are two of the key ingredients that made it happen. The left-hand one is the man in the raincoat, not the dog. This is Douglas Ainsley of D.A. Henderson. Even his wife used to call him D.A. And he's photographed there in front of the Temple of Vaccinia, which is a little shed that a friend of Jenner had built for him in the back of Jenner's house in Berkeley. And Jenner used to sit in there and vaccinate the children of the poor for free every Sunday afternoon. D.A. Henderson was put in charge of this huge operation to exterminate smallpox by the WHO. And when he was appointed, he was a very young, very junior, very green public health doctor from America. And he was effectively appointed into a position that was going to fail. Lots of internal politics in WHO at the time, there still are, but it was worse then. People who wanted money for their own pet projects, say to defeat yellow fever or malaria or measles, didn't want Henderson to have all this money to defeat smallpox. They were forever trying to torpedo him and his ambitions. And there's a story about one of the WHO mandarins who summoned Henderson to his office and said, "You're on a hiding to nothing. You're never going to get rid of smallpox. You're going to fail." And Henderson said, "No, I'm going to succeed." And the Mandarin said, "I'll bet you a tire that you will fail." So 11 years later, Henderson goes back with a tire and sticks it on the man's desk and says, "Bon appetit," because the man had offered to eat the tire as well as have it. Henderson was a ruthless man, totally ruthless, very, very bright, and he put in place people he trusted to do what needed to be done at a local level. If they didn't perform, then he sacked them and he put in people who would do better. A friend of his, Bill Foege, who went on to be the #1 Supremo, the chief of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in America, position currently occupied by Anthony Fauci, despite Trump's best efforts. Bill Foege is the one who worked out how best to use the vaccine, and that was to identify outbreaks as they were beginning, and then to move in the resources and ring vaccinate around this little focus of emerging infection. The way that you could vaccinate, say, 10,000 people in a day is shown in the right-hand picture there. This is a two-pronged or bifurcated needle. This was the brainchild of someone who had a broken sewing machine needle to try and fix one day. And what you do is you dip the pointy end, the thing is made of stainless steel, it's about 5 inches long. You dip the pointy end into a vial of vaccine, you pull it out, and there's a little drop of vaccine fluid held between the prongs. And you then scratch the skin 4 or 5 times in different directions, and you have vaccinated the patient. And at the end of the morning, you bung all the bifurcated needles in boiling water for a couple of minutes, and you sterilized the lot. So by using this ring vaccination technique and the bifurcated needle for extra speed and the organization that Henderson set up, they managed to do the job. This little girl was found hiding under a sack of flour in a little village on an island in the mouth of the Ganges, and that was in October 1975. She'd been hidden there by her mum because smallpox had gone completely from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. That was the last block in Central Asia. She was the last ever case, and because smallpox had broken out in that piddling little village and it had gone from everywhere else, the government officials and the doctors feared that they would lose their jobs. So they had to hide the evidence. So they got this little girl stuffed under a sack of flour. She recovered, as you can see. She's got some scars on her arms and face, but she's still alive and well today, actually. A couple of years later, there was still a little spot of trouble on the Horn of Africa, and the last man who got smallpox free living, as you may remember that there was an escape after this from the medical school in Birmingham that actually killed somebody from a smallpox research lab. But the last person to die of last person to get free living smallpox was a hospital porter working in an isolation hospital specializing in smallpox. And he was a volunteer vaccinator. So you would have thought that he might actually himself have been vaccinated. Well, no. What he did wrong was to get in a Jeep for about 2 minutes one evening. Jeep arrived at the front of the hospital with 2 little girls on board, both seriously ill with smallpox, one of them nearly dead. And the man, who's called Ali Marmalin, jumps into the Jeep to the front seat to show the driver where to take the girls to the isolation unit around the back of the hospital compound. And he's in the Jeep for just long enough to get smallpox himself. And the doctors missed it, actually. In the end, the nurses told him that he didn't have chicken pox, which is what the doctors thought. He had smallpox. And in that last little outbreak of 3, the 2 girls and Ali Marmalin, there was one death. That was a little girl who was nearly dead. The other 2 survived. So that last little mini outbreak of smallpox, if you like, had a mortality of 1 in 3, just as smallpox had had throughout its history. They left it for a couple of years to make sure they hadn't missed any outbreaks in development. And the 8th of May, 1980, the World Health Organization declared that target 0, in other words, a complete eradication of smallpox, had been achieved. And to this day, I believe that that's the WHO's greatest ever achievement. And this is the only human infection that we've managed to eradicate. You'll know that we're very close with polio. We're slipping away with it due to the pandemic interfering with the normal polio vaccination campaign. in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it's so close. And once we get COVID-19 out of the way, I'm sure we'll be back on track again. But smallpox is the only victory in that sense that we've had. So just going back for a moment to John Hunter, you remember that he wrote, "I can't think of anybody I'd rather write to than you." And that was Jenner. And you remember that Jenner's great defining paper, his Triumph, was published in September 1798. And unfortunately, John Hunter had fallen victim to his triad of risk factors, and he died 5 years earlier. He had angina, he had a roaring temper, and he had enemies. And it's presumed that his surgical colleagues at St. George's deliberately provoked an argument with him in order to give him a heart attack that would kill him. And that's exactly what happened. And after his death, the surgeons at St. George's had a vote to see whether they should write a letter of condolence to John Hunter's widow, and the vote was against that, so they didn't do that. Hunter, according to the practice of the day, and indeed his own wishes, was dissected in front of his students. Whenever I'm giving this talk to medical students, I tend to fix them with a very beady eye at this point in the lecture and tell them not to get ideas. But that's what they did then. And in his will, Hunter made a stipulation, which was that he was to be dissected in front of his students. They were to learn from the experience, and that 2 parts of his body were to be preserved to go into his anatomy museum. One of them was his left Achilles tendon, which he'd managed to rupture while practicing Scottish dancing at 3 o'clock one morning, and it had healed, and he wanted to know what it looked like, and he thought other people should know what it looked like as well. And the other item was his heart, because he knew he had angina, and he presumed that there was something wrong with it. Guess who did the dissection? Yep, it was the jealous brother-in-law, Everard Hume. And guess what Everard Hume did with the 2 bits that Jenner wanted to go into his, that Hunter wanted to go into his museum? Well, he threw them away. So that is a sign of just how, let's say, high emotions went at the end of the lifetime of John Hunter. So to finish off with, that's the story of Edward Jenner. He changed the face of the world, I think, in several ways. Superficially, he got rid of a disease that disfigured an awful lot of people. So you could argue that he's got rid of, for example, the wanted posters of villains who are identified by the extent of their facial scarring. He got rid of the number of people who survived smallpox but then killed themselves because they couldn't bear to look in the mirror. But he also changed the face of the world because he gave us the idea of vaccination, so protecting against the disease. You could argue that variolation already did that, but what Jenner did was to find a less dangerous surrogate and use that to induce what we now understand as an immune response to protect people against these severe infections. And it was Louis Pasteur who suggested that the generic term vaccination should be used for all inoculations that are protected against infections. And he proposed this just after he had discovered the vaccine against rabies towards the end of the 19th century. Now the picture there shows the staircase up to the Rare Books Gallery in the Wellcome Collection in London. And if you go up there, you can see the copy of the Inquiry, which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Jenner's notebook and his diary, so you can see what he did with his time during the year that the diary is available for. And also his poems, including the one about Dr. Waits's gingerbread nuts. And his name is there among the, next to Hunter, actually, which I think is a nice touch. But there with the other great names in the history of medicine. And again, he's not the first to discover vaccination or to think about it, but he's the man who really made it happen. And I think that's why his name deserves to be where it is. So I'm just going to finish off with 2 shameless plugs. One is for Dr. Jenner's house in Berkeley. Again, it's 5 miles up the road from here. This is where Jenner lived. He did his first vaccination somewhere in that building. He did all his writing there. He died there. He's buried in the church next door. Andrew Marr reckons that this is one of the 5 most important places in world history. Well, that sounds quite a big descriptor, actually, but I think he's right, because you've not only got the vaccine against smallpox, but you've got the conceptual framework for all the other dozens of infections that we're protected against. Again, it's particularly opposite today with the COVID-19 vaccines beginning to come through. But you've also arguably got the beginning of the birth, if you like, of the science of immunology. The place itself is fascinating. It's a window into the world of the medical and scientific age of enlightenment. And unfortunately, it's endangered. And it should be a World Heritage Site, in my view. The reality is that it's just a small, struggling provincial museum of the sort that is going bust at the moment, about 1 every 3 months in England. Even before COVID, it was not seeing enough visitors. It's just too far off the motorway network for people to make a pilgrimage to. I think COVID might just kill it for all time. So please go and visit it online. You can donate online. That's a very good thing to do. If you know a fairy godmother, this is the time to winch her in, because I think this would be a tragedy if it's lost forever, as it may well be. So I'm just going to finish off properly with an even more shameless plug. I had a year's sabbatical from the university to do anything, actually. It was very nice of them. So I got interested in the history of smallpox because, again, Jenner is part of the local history in the village that we moved to. And it was riveting. I really, really enjoyed it. This is the book that I wrote about it. Why should you buy it? Well, all the royalties go to the Jenner Museum, and my God, they need the money. Secondly, there are only 28 shopping days to Christmas. And if you're stuck for that Christmas present, then what better idea could you have than this? And the final thing is, it's not actually too bad. It's quite a good read. And here's the proof of that. Here's a friend of mine on page 1, and here he is just 2 pages later. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gareth, for a fascinating talk there. If I could just ask everyone just to unmute their microphones a minute, and we'll give Gareth a thoroughly deserved round of applause there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. I think it would be a really sad irony if the Jenner Museum was killed off because of the COVID.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's all get out there and buy that book. I've been watching, I've had one eye on the apps during your talk. There've been some questions coming in. I noticed we had one from, an interesting one from Rosemary Barnes I saw come in. If Rosemary's out there, I just want to ask about Lady Augustine. Rosemary, I won't steal your thunder. If you want to put that question to Gareth,
go on.
Take it away.
That I'd read about, that there was an 18th century lady who went to Switzerland, and she saw that the children there, she heard about variolation there, and when she came back she introduced it, but it was only in a very small way, so she never got any credit for it. But I can't even be sure I've got the name. I just wondered if you'd heard about her.
Yeah, I think it's Lady Mary Wortley Montagu.
It is, yep. You're right.
And she was actually in Turkey. She was the wife of the Turkish ambassador, and they practiced variolation in the ambassadorial circle there. So when she arrived, she had 2 kids at that stage. She learned of the practice of variolation because they had a variolation party for the children of the ambassadors every year. And this is where the old Turkish lady turned up with a half walnut shell filled with smallpox pus and the needle. So she decided to have her little boy done. So he was variolated, and she wrote these amazing letters home. There are just volumes of, I mean, she's a lecturer on her own, actually, incredibly colourful, lively, brilliant character. And she writes home and describes this practice and says, I'm going to have my little boy done. So when finally she comes back to England, she's actually very well connected. One of her best friends is Caroline of Ansbach, who was the Princess Regal at the time, and she managed to get the royal family tested and the senior people in the Royal College of Physicians and things. So they actually ended up with a couple of princesses being variolated as well. And it spread from there. And this is, again, as you imply, it took quite a long time for it to get going. They did all sorts of dodgy things involving prisoners in Newgate Prison and things like this to test them as guinea pigs. But finally, when they decided it was a good thing to do and it worked, it really, really took off. So you're right, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, amazing woman.
Thank you. I'm glad she's getting a bit of recognition. I mean, as well, obviously Jenner was the person who brought it to the whole population. But I just remember her name, and I'm pleased that you knew who she was.
Well, she's buried in Lichfield Cathedral, and there's a lovely book about her called The Comet of the Enlightenment. So if you want to read more about her, there's quite a lot actually about. There's a long chapter about her in the Angel of Death, but a much better book about her is called The Comet of the Enlightenment, and it's all about Lady Mary. She's just an amazing character, amazing character. Thank you.
Kirsten, I'm trying to start the video on mine, and I'm getting a message saying I can't start video because the host has stopped it.
Unfortunately, I'm not the host. I don't wield that power.
So whoever is the host, could they unmute the video?
I am but the monkey to the organ grinder. We have another.
Thank you.
We've had a question come in from Andrew Patterson. Andrew, if you're out there, if you want to put your question to Gareth yourself, but if not, I'm more than happy to put it to him. It's an interesting one about the HIV pandemic. If Andrew's out there and he wants to unmute.
I was struck some years after the successful smallpox eradication program by WHO that HIV emerged first of all in Africa, and then in Western America, and then around the world. And I've been curious and puzzled that the use of a bifurcated needle on multiple subjects might have actually initiated the rise of HIV worldwide. And I wondered if you had a view on that.
Yes, I mean, that's a good point. I said that the needles could be easily sterilized, and they could be easily sterilized, and that would kill viruses like hepatitis C and HIV. The problem was that was not always done. So if people were in a hurry, they didn't sometimes sterilize them as well as they could. I'm not aware of any evidence that HIV was transmitted, but there's good evidence that hepatitis C was. So hepatitis C, definitely. HIV, I don't think so, no. I don't think that would quite fit with the chronology. But hepatitis C within India, certainly that was spread by people not being careful enough with sterilizing the needles. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
I'm not sure
we're getting a tip here. Wentworth Castle for Lady Montagu. Wentworth Castle at Barnsley, apparently.
Yeah.
Just keep an eye there. I noticed, Rosemary, you've got another question, and it's a biggie, and it's one definitely for our time, and it's probably one we could talk about all night. Do you want to unmute and put that one to Gareth? Because I think we need to hear more about this one.
Is that the one about why some people resist vaccination?
That's the one. That's the
yes,
one.
because I mean, now that this COVID vaccine has been discovered, I mean, I think that this is a wonderful thing, but I'm just surprised at the number of people who say, well, I'm not going to have it. And it's the same thing with the flu vaccine and the MMR vaccine. And I just wondered why it is that people are so resistant to something that has been proved in the majority of cases to stop. Why is it people are so reluctant to have vaccinations?
Well, it's a good question. If we had an easy answer, then I think everybody would be a lot happier, including the anti-vaccinationists, actually. I mean, the opposition to Jenner's vaccination went back to very soon after the inquiry was published. And the first arguments. You could argue that it's history, so it doesn't matter. But actually, if you look online today and see why people are against vaccination, you can find many of the same motives. But the first vaccinations were opposed by people of the church because they felt this was defying the will of God. If God had decided you were going to die next Thursday from smallpox, then man hasn't got the right to come up with a measure to prevent that from happening. And there are still arguments advanced in the name of religion today. Again, it's interesting. I think a lot of them are not held up by really rigorous theological perusal of the relevant texts, we put it that way. I mean, it was put about, for example, that it's very non-Islamic to get vaccinated against various things. And the polio vaccine was thought to be contaminated with drugs that would sterilize young Muslim men and women. And that was put about actually by one of the senior medical officers in Nigeria. In fact, that's completely wrong. If you go on the Hajj to Mecca, you've actually got to be vaccinated against polio and diphtheria and lots of other things as well. So there are religious motives, if you like, and it's not just far out sects of Christianity. There are other religious objections as well. You had people who were worried about the dangers of vaccination. And when Jennerian vaccination was first practiced, it was a farmyard procedure, effectively, because you were collecting cowpox either from cows with lots of manure around or people whose hands were not that clean. So you could actually spread things like blood poisoning. And they had a practice where they would vaccinate communities by going there, choosing the youngest baby, vaccinating that baby, and then coming back a few days later, collecting the vaccine fluid from that baby's vaccine blister and using that to vaccinate all the other kids. And if that first baby had undiagnosed congenital syphilis, which was a problem at the time, then you would spread syphilis throughout the whole community. So there were risks, and the medical profession did not help by denying those risks. And Jenner was one of the bad people in this regard. He believed that his vaccine was completely perfect. So one single vaccination would last you for life, and it could not possibly ever have any bad side effects. So part of the anti-vaccination movement today is worry about the side effects of vaccines, and some of those concerns are legitimate. Others of those concerns are deliberately hyped up to make people do other things, which will generate money for people as part of the anti-vaccination movement. So for example, if you follow a lot of the anti-vaccination sites through, you'll discover that there are opportunities for people behind them to make money out of people having something other than vaccination. So there might be a Stone Age diet or a homeopathic cure or something like that. So the short answer to your question, I'm afraid, is a long answer, because there are so many factions in the anti-vaccination movement. It's not a single entity. It's a huge spectrum. From one end, people with valid concerns about the dangers of medicines that might not have been tested quite enough yet. You know, the COVID vaccine is a case in point at the moment, right through to people who are just in it to make money and exploit people's worries and concerns.
University lecturer or something.
We've got a question. Hugh Davis. Hugh Davis has asked something. Hugh, do you want to chip in and ask about Benjamin Jesty?
I think I'm going out.
Yes, I just wanted to ask what happened to what you know about Benjamin Jesty. He seems to be the original vaccinator, and you know what evidence there is that Jenner got his ideas from Benjamin. It's often the second person who receives the glory.
Well, Benjamin Jesty, you're quite right, and he didn't describe it, he did vaccination before, 25 years before Jenner got round to doing it. And Jesty was a farmer down in Dorset, and he worked it out for himself that people who'd had cowpox then didn't seem to get smallpox. And he decided to do cowpox to his wife and his two sons. And he found a neighbour with a cow with cowpox. He went down there, his wife had brought along a rusty knitting needle, and he stuck that into the blister and scratched it into her arm, then the son's arms. She got a septic arm, not from the cowpox, but from whichever bugs went in on the knitting needle, and nearly died. And as a result of that, the whole Jesty family got chased away. So they had to move from Yetminster down to Worthmer Travers on the Isle of Purbeck and South Dorset overlooking the sea. And because of that, he never made any publicity about it at all. Later on, when Jenner was becoming famous, some of his enemies decided to challenge his claim to be the inventor of vaccination. So they unearthed the story of Jesty and brought this then old, confused man up to London and made a huge fuss of him and presented him to the big medical societies and had his portrait painted and all this sort of thing, and to try and demolish Jenner's reputation. So Jesty did all the right things. He even had his sons variolated, just as Jenner variolated the gardener's son, to make sure that the smallpox would not take. And he did that again in London when he brought one of his sons up to London. So Jesty is indeed the originator of recorded vaccination. But again, for all the reasons, he was not medically educated. He wasn't particularly educated himself. So he couldn't spread the word and he couldn't bring it into mainstream medical practice, which is what Jenner did. So you're right, an unsung hero, very much so.
I just asked one other thing, is how you tie in the fact they presumably didn't really understand the germ theory.
No.
And yet they were, so I was wondering how that ties together with their work.
Well, they simply did not have any idea how smallpox was caused. And at the time there was miasma theory. So this was bad air, malaria means bad air. So this is the bad emanations that ooze out of the earth and things like, they believe that yellow fever came from stored coffee grounds on docksides and things like this. So there was something in the air that hit people and caused these diseases. And germ theory didn't come along for another half century really after Jenner. So they had no idea what was causing it. Jenner actually talks about a virus causing smallpox, but he didn't mean a virus as we'd understand it today. Virus is just it was just a Latin derived word then in use, meaning something nasty or evil or poisonous. So when Jenner talks about a virus, he's just talking about something unpleasant, not a microbiological entity.
Hey, Gareth, do you think you have time for 2 last quick questions?
If you've got the stamina, yes, go for it, go.
So Rachel Unsworth, you've got an interesting one here about the Lunar Society. Do you want to come in with that, Rachel?
Well, I just wonder about whether there were active links between the Lunar Society people that included in some way Priestley himself and the Convivio group of the medics.
Almost certainly not. There are actually 2 medical drinking eating societies that Jenner belonged to. The one I mentioned was the Convivio Medical,
yes,
the order of the words, and this was held in the inn at Alverson, just up the road. There was also the Medico Convivial Society, where they had rather better meetings and rather, that high quality of scientific discussion, if you like, but they still ate and drank a lot. But these were 2 very much local societies that I'm not aware of any further links. They had links with each other, but I don't think they went any further afield.
I was just also thinking there, just a very almost trivial point, but that surely another person you would have wanted at your fantasy medical dinner party would have been Erasmus Darwin.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. Well, of course, he was anti-vaccination.
Oh, was he?
Yeah. Together with lots of other people. I mean, if you look back over the, I think he ended his days being pro, but he was certainly anti it for a while. Wallace was very strongly anti-vaccination. George Bernard Shaw was as well. A filthy, disgusting invention was what he called vaccination. And nowadays, look at the people that the anti-vaxxers can get in. A struck-off nurse, Tom Cruise, pretty destitute, really.
Probably leading on from that theme, we've got a question from Catherine Waits. Catherine, do you want to unmute and come in with that one?
Yeah, I was just curious, in your opinion, what the biggest barrier or thing preventing big, large-scale vaccination programs like they did for smallpox from happening for other vaccines? Because obviously the other vaccines exist. Most of us have all had them, I assume. Is it just the widespread anti-vax movements? I mean, I know that there's a lot of issues with funding, and you know, like the new Pfizer vaccine for COVID has to be stored at -50 degrees and can't be transported. And do those sorts of issues exist for most vaccines? Yeah, that was it.
No, it's a very good question. It's partly a question of practicality, the availability of a really good vaccine, the will to make it happen, and also things like the absence of other places where the infection can go. So the things that you can eradicate are the things that do not go into other species. So interestingly, at the moment, we might come up with a perfectly good COVID vaccine, but we know that at least some strains of COVID go into minks. And it may be that our attempts to get rid of COVID will actually be undone by transmission into other groups of animals and then seeding the infection back into humanity. And now, you know, if smallpox were to come back, we would have a big problem because there aren't enough doses left. There are some stored in most countries, but not enough to vaccinate everybody. But to go back to your question, I mean, I think the other good examples would be things like measles and polio. And polio, again, that's a vaccine that needs to be kept cold, the oral one that is used in the largest scale vaccination campaigns, particularly the ones in Afghanistan, Pakistan at the moment. That needs to be kept cold, so you need a cold chain. It doesn't have to be -80, which is what the Pfizer one needs at the moment, but it still needs to be kept cold. There's the will, there's the money, because these things are actually hugely expensive to do, and simply mobilizing enough people to vaccinate 10,000 people in an area in a day, and to do that over a large geographical area, you know, the country the size of India, which is what they do with polio, which is a huge undertaking. So you need international cooperation, you need the WHO behind you, you need an awful lot of money. The polio campaign, I can't remember how many billion it's cost, it's something like 20 billion, I think, US dollars. And it's funded by WHO, the Gates Foundation, UNICEF, Rotary International raised a huge amount of money for it. And every year it's not quite enough, you know. So I think it's a combination of needing a good vaccine, needing a good target, and needing everybody agreeing that it's something you want to prioritize.
Okay, well, I've been keeping my eye on the chat room. I've been trying to run through the participants gallery to see if anybody's got their hands up. So if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank you all for your questions. And if I could hand over to Professor Tony North to ask him to give the vote of thanks to Gareth, please.
Thank you. Well, it's a very great pleasure to give thanks to Gareth for what's been a fascinating talk. It is, of course, the Priestley Lecture in which the Phil and Lit joins with the Leeds Library and the church at which Priestley was the chaplain or the priest in charge. Priestley, was a polymath like Jenner and Hunter, as you've mentioned. Priestley, of course, was not only a clergyman, but he was the chap who discovered oxygen, so he was a chemist of some standing, and he also became a politician. And the politics, I think, caused him to be thrown out of Birmingham, and he eventually retreated to the States. Well, I think there's a suggestion that it was Priestley who got in touch with Jefferson and was in some ways involved with passing on the idea of vaccination there. So there's good contact there, and a similarity between in the characters of these various people who have made their mark on history, and a particularly important aspect of history, the development of science into a medically important area. And of course, we're seeing that going on at the moment with COVID, where the number of people in the scientific area who have been involved in trying to sort out what can be done about this virus is absolutely enormous in number and in collaboration between people from widely different countries as well. Many of them clearly working for the good of mankind and not for the good of their pockets, as was the case with people like Jenna. So thank you very much indeed, Gareth. Sorry we can't actually talk to you in person, but it's great to have you at the end of the screen there. Thank you very much. Now, just before I stop, two little plugs on behalf of the Leeds Phil and Lit Society. The first is very exciting that a week today there will be at the annual general meeting of the Society, which will again be held by Zoom, and that is for members of the Society, all of whom will be getting details of it. And then our next talk will be at the end of January, January the 21st. Professor Julian Rushton will be talking about Beethoven. Now, he did endeavour to give such a talk a month or two ago, and the Zoom facility was not exactly working at his end, so I'm afraid that had to get abandoned, but he will be redoing it for us at the end of January. And I think we need to send congratulations to all of those who have been involved in setting up this arrangement today. Anyway, thank you very much, Gareth.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Shall we mute our mics again and give Gareth and Tony a round of applause there? And Gareth, you should know you've got an absolute stream of compliments flowing in here on the chat. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Very fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth.
Pleasure.
Oh, lovely
Thank
message.
you. Excellent.
Lovely message from Iona McCleary about her father having been involved in the eradication in East Africa.
Ah, right.
That's amazing. Lovely.
Okay, and thanks once again to everyone for tuning in this evening. What's been a fascinating evening. So